Hey, everybody. So, a lot happening. Wanted to just inform you, my loyal YouTube viewership, that thanks in large part, to your generous contributions over the past 2 weeks or so, I am currently embarking on a kind of road trip. Call it a reporting trip, call it whatever you'd like. I don't even know what I would necessarily call it, but I do know that I'm traveling around parts of the United States with the aim primarily of gauging some of the aftermath of the riots and protests that have occurred on such a pervasive scale. One thing that's fascinating about what's gone on these past few weeks is that you see protest actions and riots as well in places that you never really would have expected. It's astoundingly prevalent in its ubiquity. So, for example, yesterday I was looking at a map of Pennsylvania that some news organization had compiled to identify where protest actions had occurred. And even in the most rural, conservative parts of the state, there have been protests. Now, they're not going to get a whole lot of attention compared to other places, and a lot of the media focus tends to be on some of these big city actions. And I've covered or observed some of them as well. But to me, in a way, it's even more interesting that you see some of this stuff popping up in places that, as far as a lot of people can tell, virtually never have had public protests. Like I know, for instance, in my hometown in New Jersey, there was a relatively substantial protest on the main street there, the main avenue. And just talking to my friends that I grew up with, we could barely even fathom this suburban town in New Jersey ever hosting a protest or being a site where a protest would take place, much less a large one like this. And I think part of the explanation for it is that you have the organizers of these protests being very activated, connected young people on social media who get the backing of their parents, of their school administrators, and even in many cases, the police themselves to hold these protests. So this is a protest movement that is different from protest movements of the past, it would seem, where there often was like a generational divide, right? Like, so in the 60s, which is almost sort of a cliched example, but the protest movement led by young people was often done over the objections of or in defiance of their parents, right? Or their school administrators or others in positions of authority. Whereas today, all those actors seem to be kind of working in concert. And it's not going to be the same exact situation everywhere in the country. Clearly, the city officials are not endorsing like the more extreme rioting. But in terms of the protest actions, these are all being done with what amounts to in total societal support, or if not total, large scale societal support. Like, for example, on Sunday, I went to one of these actions that are still happening in Schwenksville, Pennsylvania, which is in Montgomery County. And you had the Board of Education president speak. You had the congresswoman from the area speak, Madeline Dean, who I spoke to myself. So that'll probably come out in a forthcoming article. So be on the lookout for that. And local elected officials participating, and you see this nationwide. So there's no compunction on the part of the people who are in the sort of local power structure to engage and participate in these actions. That's why I almost think that the term protest is a bit of a misnomer. Because, like, if you have almost complete assent within the local power structures for your actions, like, what are you protesting exactly? Like, I almost liken these more to just civic style events. I mean, we really need a new term because, like, what I'm about to describe doesn't perfectly capture it, but to me, it's more reminiscent of when a town holds, and this is more, I guess, confined to the suburban and rural instances of these events. But, like, for example, in Schwenksville on Sunday, and this is part of a pattern that I've seen elsewhere, I would liken these gatherings, and they are mass gatherings, and they are still technically not permitted, okay, by the existing state law and local law. I liken them more to like a public holiday, like a 4th of July ceremony or a Christmas tree lighting ceremony. Some kind of civic event that is just seen as accepted and backed by the state, organized by the state, facilitated by the state, with the involvement of sort of like local civic leaders. And so the term protest doesn't really capture that dynamic for me. I mean, so we got to come up with a new term. I got to think about it a little more and maybe see if there's a term that is more suitable. State-backed protest almost seems like a oxymoron, right? But they are state-backed protests. Anyway, so I'm going around and observing, covering much of the stuff, be writing. Should have a piece coming out either today or tomorrow, which I will share and do a separate video on, related to the media and how this moral panic that's erupted has really engulfed the media to an astonishing degree. I'm not going to get into that in much more detail right now because I'm going to wait till that piece comes out, because I often like, if you're a new subscriber, maybe you'll not be familiar with this, but for the most part, not all the time, but one of my general the general tack that I like to take is not to just go on to a stream and just rant aimlessly. I like to tether it to if I've written something tangible, which I can then expand upon in the form of a live stream. Again, there are exceptions, and I don't always follow that by the letter. But the point being that I'm going to be going around to many of these places. I'm going to go to Chicago. I'm going to go to Minneapolis. Probably some other places in between. Like today, I'm headed to Fort Wayne, Indiana. I'm in Pittsburgh right now, where there was a little bit of rioting, not really anything on the scale of you see elsewhere. But I'm going to go to Fort Wayne, Indiana today, where there was rioting. I mean, where there was storefronts bashed in. And I'm going to take a look at it for myself, because something about the scale of this seems like it hasn't been adequately conveyed. Like, we had rioting all over the country within an extremely confined period of time, for the most part from, like, I would say, the weekend after the George Floyd killing was the apex of it, where it seemed like there was just rioting everywhere. Not everywhere, literally, but across the country on a scale that strikes me as unprecedented in terms of the rapidity with which it materialized, and in terms of the geographic pervasiveness of it. So that's why I'm extremely fascinated by this, and because to me, there's a way to connect it to the moral panic that has characterized American politics and culture writ large since 2016. And in that sort of spectrum of moral panic, I include stuff like Russiagate. I include stuff like Me Too to some extent. I include stuff like Nazi alarmism, where at one point we were being told that fascists and Nazis were taking over American streets at the direction of their beloved fascist president. And none of that's accurate. All those things have some partial basis in fact, but they all took on the characteristics of just a straight up moral panic. And so I think something similar applies to this current situation where, yeah, George Floyd was killed wrongfully. I don't think anybody really doubts that at this point. And sure enough, the state authorities swiftly moved to punish the people, meaning the police officers who perpetrated the wrongful killing. But a lot of this sort of ancillary stuff, or the stuff that arose from that initial killing, have nothing to do with the killing per se. It's all about fomenting a moral panic and using the moral panic as leverage to get what you want, to gain and acquire power. That's what you see happening in the media, where you have like editors being ousted, media outlets being accused of like institutional racism. It's all those. It's a power play at bottom, and moral panics tend to give you the ammunition that you can use to give your grievances and moral salience, even if the moral salience is like patently unempirical, or if it's not grounded in anything that's remotely empirical. It's still you can instrumentalize it to your own advantage, and that's what's happening. And so I want to go and observe some of this myself, like Fort Wayne, Indiana. I mean, did you even know that rioting occurred in Fort Wayne, Indiana? I didn't until I specifically looked it up this morning. So I'm going to go there and go around. And, if you have any suggestions for me for things to check out on this roughly speaking, this route, like I said, I'm in Pittsburgh now, going to go to Fort Wayne. I think I'm going to go to Madison, Wisconsin, going to go to Chicago, Minneapolis, and I'm open to suggestions for stuff along that general route to go check out, people to talk to, etc. And, again, a lot of this is due in part to the support that I've received online financially in the past few weeks. This enables me to go out and do stuff like this. And the reason why I titled this video, "Are You Suffering from White Fragility?" is because as I'm driving, what I'm going to be doing is listening to this book, White Fragility, by Robin DiAngelo, which is now a blockbuster bestseller. Which is now at the top of the Amazon bestseller list, top of the New York Times bestseller list. Everybody's buying this. If you go to some of these, not everybody, but I mean, lots of people are buying this book. Robin DiAngelo is going to be a very wealthy person, white lady, of course. And if you go to many of these events, I wish I had the document with me now. It's in the car. But often what they'll do is they'll hand out recommended materials, further reading for people to do. And one of the recommended books that almost invariably gets placed on these documents is the White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. So I plead guilty. I bought the book. I bought the an audio copy. Hold on a second. Just got a phone call there. I'm not telling you who it was. I purchased a copy technically of this Robin DiAngelo book on audiobook so I could listen to it in the car. So now my purchase for $15 is in the tally of Robin DiAngelo's, blockbuster, staggering success. And I've listened to the introduction and I think 2 chapters so far. And her claim is circular. Her thesis is circular. Her thesis is that because Robin DiAngelo, conducted these corporate diversity training sessions, she's in a position to identify reactions among whites in those diversity sessions as substantiating or establishing her thesis of white fragility, which is that the thesis being that white people are kind of like instinctively resistant to talking about race, talking about their quote whiteness. And she condemns in particular white progressives. She says white progressives do the most harm of anybody to non-whites, in particular people of color, because they think that they're doing good. They think that they're helping the position of blacks, they think that they are behaving in ways which is to the benefit of blacks, but in fact, they're doing them even more harm than anybody else. That's what she says. And that's why I think you see white progressives being at the forefront of this movement. Because given this like anti-racism ideology that's being propounded by way of books like Robin DiAngelo's and some others, the people really being indicted most harshly are the quote unquote white progressives. And Robin DiAngelo states as much explicitly in her book. But the thesis is circular because she says that if you're white and you object in any way to her thesis, if you contest any of the claims, if you raise even just mild concerns about the veracity of different aspects of what she's arguing, then you are substantiating her thesis. You're providing additional evidence for her thesis, because by mere fact of you objecting, you're proving that you suffer from white fragility. The only way to not suffer from white fragility, per Robin DiAngelo, is just accept what she's saying without thinking about it too deeply. And so the call here is to turn off your critical faculties, and that's just not a call I'll ever accept. And I reject that my declination to accede to the demands of people like Robin DiAngelo means that I'm somehow not attentive enough to issues of racial disparity in the United States. Clearly, that's a problem in a variety of respects dating back many years, including in the area of policing. I don't deny that for a second. I covered stop and frisk in New York City when it was at its peak in the latter part of the Bloomberg mayoralty. And there was no doubt that that had a disproportionate effect wrongfully on black and in particular non-white New Yorkers, not exclusively, but yes, there was a disproportionate racial impact there. So I'm not denying that, but I'm denying that requires me to just become a mindless propagator of this new ideology that seems to have been foisted upon the culture and the political structures seemingly overnight. So the moral blackmail techniques and forcible impositions don't work on me. But nonetheless, I am going to listen to this book and try to understand its claims a little more deeply, because it's obviously very prevalent now, and you're almost required to read it. The other disturbing thing is, and I'll probably devote something specific to this book. I don't know what yet exactly, but one of the most disturbing aspects of this is that Robin DiAngelo states outright that one of her intentions, is to cultivate what she calls white. Let me make sure I have the right exact word here. Okay, so she says that her ambition is to cultivate what she calls a quote white identity, a collective quote white identity, and a white consciousness in order to combat racism. She says the only way that racism can really be combated is to cultivate a collective white consciousness and white identity among whites. And if you guys, I'm sure there may even be some of you in this chat right now, but if you follow, broadly speaking, alt-right discourse or white nationalist quote unquote discourse, I'm not talking about the people who just get labeled white nationalists willy-nilly, but the people who actually spend a lot of time theorizing this stuff and have a worldview. They say that that's their objective too. They want to cultivate a white identity. They want to cultivate a white consciousness to achieve their own objectives, which are different from Robin DiAngelo's, but nonetheless, the tactic there, the strategy is the same. So I'm virtually certain this is going to produce some kind of reactionary backlash. I don't know how widespread it will be, but if you think that telling that everybody who is in good standing in society that they need to have a collective white consciousness is not going to be maybe taken the wrong way by certain people, then you're pretty delusional. Okay. And so the fact that this has become so prominent and mainstream, and again, almost like mandatory reading within certain circles, including corporate circles, media circles, I have zero doubt that it's going to produce a backlash in ways that we probably can't fully predict right now, but nonetheless will happen. It will be disturbing, and it could be violent. So, it's altogether quite a depressing set of circumstances. But that's what happens when you're living in a rapidly declining hegemonic power such as the United States. Okay, that's it for now. Let me check to see if I've had any super chats. Kessler says something that I'm not going to repeat just because it's not worth getting into right now. Okay, thank you, everybody. Again, if you want to help fund any of the stuff that I'm doing, I always put my funding mechanisms in the description box, and I've added 2 more now. So you have Patreon, PayPal, Bitcoin, and I'm also adding Venmo and Cash App. Okay. And like I said, if you have any suggestions for stuff for me to go to look at along the way here, message me through email or Twitter DM, and I'll take it into consideration. And talk to you later.